So there's a lot to talk about in regard to law and order as well today. We're talking about prisons. We're also talking about Sadiq Khan, Sir Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. He has called for cannabis to be decriminalised. I think he's wrong. Jason Reid is the co-executive director of Law Enforcement Action Partnership, or LEAP, and joins me now. Jason, I think you disagree with me and you agree with Sir Sadiq Khan. Can you just tell us why? You're very welcome to the programme, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Peter. So, as you can imagine, I do disagree with you. And we actually gave evidence towards the report that's being highlighted today. And you have to excuse me, I've got a virus. That's always useful for telly.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope your voice gets better soon.
I've got a 4-year-old, so and it's always a case that the report doesn't quite go far enough for us. So, completely agree with the recommendations for decriminalisation. Because one of the things that we need to look at is the holistic approach to this. This is a criminal justice system issue. Should it be a health-based issue, which is what we think it should be? So the organisation I represent is Law Enforcement Action Partnership. We're a collective of police from across the world. In this country, we've got undercover officers, we've got police constables, we've got MI5 officers. So we've got the full spectrum of the criminal justice system. And every single one of them that we come in contact with, even people that go off the record, say this approach does not work. Going up to people on the street, stop and searching them for the smell of cannabis, actually erodes the trust between society and the police. We've actually got a county lines problem now because predominantly of the nature of the drug market. So as you can imagine, the drug market is lucrative. People are always going to be involved in the drug trade in some sort of way. How do we ameliorate that? How do we get on top of that? Well, the criminal justice system approach we've been doing since 1971. The Misuse of Drugs Act has been there since that. And it's got worse from that point on. We've never had success rates. We have busts. We have these emblematic positions of seizures that are constantly on our headlines, but it's actually not denting the market. The market actually increases in value. The irony is every time you get a seizure, it actually makes the drug market more disruptive, and it actually makes everything more violent for every single one of us. So all the while we've got an inflated price on cannabis, which it is, this is a weed, it can grow anywhere. We have such inflated prices on this because of the value of what it, and that, of course, organised crime gets hold of. So how do we get control of that market, and how do we stop people from getting into that hold of the market in the first place? Because obviously we've got things like cuckooing as well, where vulnerable people having their homes taken over, they're having all sorts of things.
But would any of that actually stop if we legalise cannabis?
It would certainly have an impact, probably overnight, we'd imagine. If you look at the facts and figures from America have got their own issues going on with the over-commercialisation. That's something we definitely do have to address. If we do want to go down the route of legalising and regulating, the over-commercialisation is something that we do have to think about, and which is why we think in terms more of like the German market. The German market is very conservative. So what they've done is they legalised cannabis, but they put limits on THC, they put limits on...
What's THC, Jason?
So we've got two components, main components of cannabis. You've got THC, which is kind of almost like, to put it in layman's terms, like heady high. And then the CBD, which I imagine most people know because it's in every one of our shops now. The CBD component you really do need in cannabis because it helps ameliorate the potential for the adverse effects of cannabis, and it just helps having that kind of holistic approach.
Okay. So my issue with this is, Jason, we know cannabis is bad. We know it can help some people. Certainly, I've had an MS patient, for example. You know, my best friend as well has MS. She takes cannabinoid substances, not smoking cannabis, but taking sort of pills and supplements that actually help her illness and help her symptoms. I get that. I understand that. I'm no problem with that being used in the medicalised way for people who have issues there. But, and you could say this about cigarettes, you could say this about alcohol. If they came onto the market now, if they didn't exist previously and they suddenly existed, we would ban them. The point with cannabis is we know it's bad. We know that it has mental health implications. We know that there are people drug driving, for example. We know that there are people turning up to work who are stoned. And the fact is that if we don't have some sort of societal way or legal way to say, this is wrong, you shouldn't have it, you shouldn't possess it, and you shouldn't smoke it, well, maybe we're at that point already where the police have just given up. And that's what really concerns me.
That is one of the issues that we get put to us is, should we have a conceited approach to actually go ahead and actually prosecute? In which case, that might lead us to another subject we might address, which is the overpopulation of prisons and the burden on the criminal justice.
And I get that, Jason. I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Jason, but my point is that just because we have police who are stretched, just because we have prisons that are overstretched. I realise those are real big issues. We've been talking about them at other stages of the programme as well today. But just because that's the case doesn't mean that we should say, well, actually, we're going to decriminalise this. That shouldn't be I know it is an argument, and I get it, but it shouldn't be an argument to simply say, well, our prisons are full.
I'm going to go back just a step to what you said about the regulated cannabis market and how the harm and the perception of harm that's out there. I'm going to remove my hat just for a moment as the executive director of Elite UK. I'm actually a medicinal cannabis user myself. I'm actually got a legal prescription that's right next to me out there. I'm not currently under the influence, just to kind of put that out there. I'm just naturally bumbly. And it's a case of when I'm speaking to people that don't have that much of an idea about cannabis, obviously for me, for someone that's got health problems this has a positive effect on, I'm very conscious of the advice that I give other people that might want to be trying the substance. My advice to most people would be, do not touch the substances that are out on the street, because you don't know what you're getting. There's no regulation involved, which means that you don't know what the THC and CBD qualities are. It might be cut with other things, like there's a thing called grit weed, where to get the weight up, to get an inflated price, people are putting glass and grit onto it, which has been a tactic for the last sort of 10 or so years. I, as someone that is very, very conscious of my health because of my own legacy with chronic illness, would not recommend someone to take street cannabis. The system that I've got, which has been formulated under a medical cannabis regime, it's tested, it's grown locally, it's actually grown quite close to me. And it goes through every system check that you can possibly imagine. And as you can imagine, it doesn't necessarily come with the health warnings that we're speaking about, because it has got so much evidence towards it. So as someone that ingests it on a daily basis...
How do you actually take it? What do you actually do to take it and put it in your body?
So what happens, the whole system, just to very, very quickly explain. So what happens to me is that I go online, I go to my pharmacy, I order it, it comes through a courier. I have to give the courier a PIN to make sure that it's me that's obtaining it, so it doesn't go to someone else. From that point, I then take it, put it into the systems that I want. I put it into child protection, because child protective cases, and then I grind it up and put it into a vaporizer. So I'm just getting the vaporization of the CBD and the THC. So I'm not getting the kind of the burnt chemicals and everything that can come with that. So it's very important to me, someone that's very interested in my health, to not go down the route of street cannabis, burning it and other forms of it. That's not to discourage people that do that, because there is an autonomy issue in this that we do need to address, because there are people, there are very responsible consumers out there, just as the same as someone who can go down the pub and drink a pint of beer. You've got the same stakes in other drugs, and
but that's been prescribed to you, and I'm sure totally legitimately you take that, and I have no issue with that, and that's helping your medical symptoms. But you know, you're saying people are responsibly taking cannabis and smoking it. They're still doing so illegally.
But that's the aspect we need to debate, which is why I'm more effective for people like you to have that discussion. Why is it illegal? Because the Misuse of Drugs Act says so. And the reason, because the Misuse of Drugs Act puts it in that category, which is category B, is because of the perceived harms, which is where the science and evidence comes into it, which is why you may have heard of Professor Nutt, who's had a big fallout in 20 years ago with the Home Secretary at the time, Alan Johnson. The idea is to put the Misuse of Drugs Act into a scheduling of harm. Well, if that is arbitrary, then all of a sudden everything is thrown off from that point. Education goes out the window, because cannabis is actually one of the lower rungs. Alcohol is at the top. So we've actually regulated one of the harmful substances, but we've got regulation on alcohol. In the 20s, and we always have to use this example, it's a cliche, but in the 20s in America, we had prohibition.
Prohibition doesn't work. Yeah,
it led to Al Capone, it led to moonshine. We've repeated the history. We've got exactly the same thing. We've got moonshine on the streets. We've got Al Capone on our streets. We've got county lines because of prohibition. History has repeated itself, and we're not going to get out of that all the while, because people are going to want to consume, and that's what we need to do.
But you could say that though, you could say that though about heroin, for example, which is a much more, you know, I know there are needle exchanges. I've had this debate on my programs previously about heroin and needle exchanges. There are much more addictive and much more harmful substances, and I maintain my belief that cannabis, not the way you take it, but the way other people, skunk or street cannabis or spice or those kind of drugs, are incredibly dangerous. They're also gateway drugs to other things as well, and we know they have a harmful effect on people's mental health. The fact is that, I mean, you can make that argument really about any harmful substance, can you not, Jason?
And that's where we need to educate the consumers. You use the word there that constantly flags up to us, it's the gateway drug. The gateway drug is a flawed theory for various different reasons, but the main reason that it could be consumed as a gateway drug is because of the change in the illicit market. So the people that are selling you currently on the illicit market, as you said, skunk, which again is, I won't get into that issue, but it's another contentious term. They're also selling you drugs of heroin. But to go specifically to the point of heroin, this is why the word legalisation is misleading. We don't talk in terms of legalisation, it's more regulation, which I know is going to be a buzz term that people are going to just turn off from. But the point of heroin specifically is that we've just had 2 officers up in Scotland, Ian Andrews and Simon McLean, a former undercover officer and a former police inspector. They visited the Thistle Centre in Glasgow, which is a safe consumption room, which means that people can go there, consume their drugs on site, they get the medical attention they need, they get services offered to them of, housing offerings and harm reduction services. This is a sensible harm reduction in placement that has benefits to all of us, because we're a society. We need to operate as a community. And if you've got vulnerable people that are consuming drugs problematically as we see it, how do we help them out of that cycle? Well, the current laws don't help that. It actually stigmatizes. We've got facts and figures from the US which indicate if you are someone that's suffering addiction, especially on opiates, you're reluctant to call for help services, especially ambulance in terms of overdose, because of what the law does to you. The law has become a barrier to help.
Okay. Jason, really interesting to talk to you. I'm afraid you haven't convinced me today, but you've certainly given me a lot of food for thought. I'm not going to ask you what your medical condition is because it's none of my business, but all I want to say is I wish you well, and thank you for speaking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
That's Jason Reid there, who's the co-executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I found that really interesting. I love speaking to people who disagree with me and hearing their different arguments. He didn't persuade me. Maybe he persuaded you. Maybe you think he's talking sense. 03